The sound of a bulldozer ripping through concrete is not something you expect to wake up to on a quiet Tuesday morning. But there I was, standing barefoot on my front lawn, coffee mug in hand, watching my driveway collapse into what looked like the gaping maw of hell. Dust filled the air. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains or stood slack-jawed on their porches. And there she was, Karen, the HOA president, smiling smugly as if she had just won a war. "Excuse me," I shouted over the roar of machinery. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen didn't even flinch. She turned her head slowly, her oversized sunglasses reflecting the chaos she had orchestrated. "Mr. Thompson," she said in that syrupy tone that made my blood boil, "this structure is non-compliant with HOA regulations. It's being removed." Non-compliant? The tunnel she was tearing down wasn't just some random hole in the ground. It was a piece of history. My grandfather, a proud Army Corps engineer, had built it in 1952 during the height of Cold War paranoia. It was part bomb shelter, part storm drain, and entirely legal. In fact, it was federally registered as a historical landmark. But Karen didn't care about any of that. To her, it was an eyesore that didn't fit her vision of our cookie-cutter neighborhood. I felt my hands clench around my coffee mug as I tried to process what was happening. "You can't just..." I started, but Karen cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "Oh, I can," she said with a smirk. "The HOA has full authority to enforce compliance. Let me back up for a second because this story doesn't start with a bulldozer. It starts with my grandfather's legacy. After he passed away last year, I inherited his house. It wasn't just any house. It was our house, the one where he raised my dad and where I spent every summer as a kid. The tunnel wasn't just some quirky feature. It was a symbol of his ingenuity and patriotism. When I moved in, I thought I'd be dealing with minor repairs and maybe some nosy neighbors, not an HOA president on a power trip. Karen had been elected just 6 months ago, and since then, she'd turned our once friendly neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. Trash bins left out too long? Fined. Grass half an inch too tall? Fined. Wind chimes? Banned entirely because they were distracting. And now this. The first time Karen mentioned the tunnel was during an HOA meeting 2 months ago. She called it a hazard and claimed it violated neighborhood aesthetics. I tried explaining its historical significance and even showed her the federal registration papers, but she waved them off like they were monopoly money. "This is private property," I told her firmly. "Not when it impacts the community," she snapped back. I should have seen this coming when she started sending me violation notices. First about my mailbox being too rustic. It's literally just wood. Then about my driveway having cracks. It's called character, Karen. But I never imagined she'd escalate to this level. As I stood there watching years of history crumble under Karen's orders, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about the tunnel anymore. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could bulldoze over people's lives without consequence. I turned to the growing crowd of neighbors and shouted, "Does anyone else think this is insane? She's destroying history. This tunnel was built by the Army Corps of Engineers." Some nodded hesitantly. Others avoided eye contact. Karen had them all scared stiff with her fines and threats. And this is where I need your help. Have you ever dealt with someone like Karen? An HOA nightmare? A bossy neighbor? What did you do? Comment below. I need all the advice I can get. Karen strutted off like she'd just solved world hunger while I stood there fuming. The demolition crew continued their work as if nothing was wrong. Probably because they didn't know they were tearing down federally protected property. But here's the thing about people like Karen. They think they're untouchable until they're not. As I walked back inside to grab my phone and call every lawyer I could think of, one thought kept running through my mind. She has no idea what she's just started. The dust had barely settled from the demolition when Karen decided to double down. If I thought her bulldozer stunt was the peak of her madness, I was sorely mistaken. Karen wasn't just a woman on a mission. She was a dictator in yoga pants, wielding HOA regulations like they were the 10 Commandments. And now she was coming for me with everything she had. You see, Karen wasn't always the HOA president. She used to be just another neighbor, albeit one who complained about everything from kids playing basketball to squirrels, ruining the landscaping. But 6 months ago, She orchestrated her coup. The election was held at 10 a.m. on a Wednesday, when most residents were at work or otherwise occupied. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Karen had secured her throne. Since then, she turned the HOA into her personal empire. Fines for leaving trash cans out 5 minutes too long? Check. Mandatory approval for holiday decorations? Double check. A ban on wind chimes because they were too distracting? Triple check. Karen didn't just enforce rules. She invented them. After the demolition fiasco, I thought Karen might back off, but no. She decided to escalate. She started sending me violation notices every week, each one more ridiculous than the last. First, it was about my mailbox being too rustic. Then it was my driveway having cracks. Finally, she claimed my backyard fence wasn't painted in an HOA-approved shade of beige. But the tunnel? That was her white whale. She couldn't stand that it existed, let alone that it was legally protected. I tried reasoning with her again and showed her the federal registration papers proving its historical significance. Karen, I said as calmly as I could manage, this tunnel is registered with the National Park Service as a Cold War landmark. You can't just tear it down. She stared at me like I just told her Elvis was still alive. Well, she said with a condescending smile, my compliance consultant says otherwise. Compliance consultant? What compliance consultant? I later found out it was just her nephew who'd taken one online course in urban planning. Karen's next move was classic HOA warfare. Fines and threats of legal action. She sent me notices claiming I owed thousands of dollars for non-compliance with HOA rules. She even threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay up. I responded with polite but firm letters explaining that her actions violated federal law and that the tunnel's status as a historical landmark superseded any HOA regulations. But Karen ignored every single one of them. At this point, I realized reasoning with her wasn't going to work. Karen wasn't interested in facts or logic. She wanted control. Here's where things started to get interesting. Karen's antics weren't just affecting me. They were ticking off everyone in the neighborhood. My next-door neighbor, Mike, told me she'd fined him $200 for having unauthorized garden gnomes. Another neighbor got hit with a $500 fine for parking his truck in his own driveway because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. People started whispering about how Karen had gone too far, but no one wanted to confront her directly. She had them all scared stiff with her fines and threats. As Karen's obsession grew, so did my determination to fight back. I started compiling every piece of evidence I could find: emails, notices, photos of the tunnel before and after the demolition, and began researching HOA laws and regulations. But here's the thing. Karen wasn't bluffing when she said she had full authority to enforce compliance. At least not according to our HOA bylaws. And that meant this fight wasn't going to be easy. Karen was convinced she could bully me into submission, but what she didn't realize was that she'd made one crucial mistake: tearing down federally protected property without proper permits or inspections. And trust me, that mistake was going to cost her dearly. If Karen's HOA reign of terror was a slow-burning fire, the morning the bulldozer showed up was the moment someone tossed gasoline on it. After weeks of back-and-forth letters, ignored warnings, and mounting fines, I thought things couldn't possibly get worse. I was wrong. Karen wasn't just doubling down. She was going all in. It happened early on a Saturday morning, the kind of quiet morning when you're supposed to be sipping coffee and reading the paper, not staring out your window at heavy machinery rolling onto your property. I heard the rumble before I saw it. By the time I threw on a pair of jeans and ran outside, a demolition crew was already setting up shop in my backyard. "What the hell is this?" I yelled, waving my arms like a lunatic. The foreman, a burly guy in a neon vest who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, shrugged. "We're here to finish the job," he said, gesturing toward the partially collapsed tunnel. "Finish the job?" I repeated, incredulous. "You mean illegally destroy federal property?" The guy scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, lady from the HOA hired us. Said it was all cleared." Of course she did. Karen had probably handed him some half-baked paperwork and called it a day. I whipped out my phone and started snapping pictures of everything: the crew, the equipment, the gaping hole where my grandfather's tunnel used to be. I didn't think it could get any worse, until it did. As soon as the bulldozer started moving dirt, something shifted beneath the surface. The ground trembled like an earthquake, and then came the sound. A deep, guttural crack. The tunnel roof gave way completely, collapsing into itself and creating a massive sinkhole in my backyard. Neighbors started gathering again, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their porches with their phones out. Others ventured closer to gawk at the destruction. Karen showed up moments later, strutting across my lawn like she owned the place. "Mr. Thompson," she said with that infuriating smirk of hers, "I warned you this would happen if you didn't comply." "Comply?" I shouted. "You just caused a sinkhole. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Karen waved dismissively at the chaos behind me. "The HOA has full authority to address non-compliant structures." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was acting like she'd just removed an old shed instead of destroying a piece of history, and my backyard along with it. As luck would have it, someone had already called 911, probably one of my more sensible neighbors, and within minutes, firefighters and police officers were on the scene. The fire chief took one look at the sinkhole and immediately radioed for backup. "This isn't just property damage," he said grimly after I explained what had happened. "This is a public safety issue." I handed him copies of the federal registration papers for the tunnel and watched as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Wait," he said slowly. "You're telling me this was a federally protected structure?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said through gritted teeth. Karen tried to intervene at this point, but the fire chief shut her down with one sharp look. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you need to step back." For once in her life, Karen actually listened. While the authorities assessed the damage, Karen hovered nearby like an overzealous hall monitor trying to eavesdrop on everyone's conversations. When reporters from a local news station arrived, because of course someone had tipped them off, Karen immediately positioned herself in front of their cameras. "This is about maintaining community standards," she told them with her best fake smile. "The HOA is committed to ensuring all properties are safe and compliant." Safe? Compliant? My backyard looked like a war zone. Couldn't hold back anymore. "Are you kidding me?" I shouted loud enough for everyone, including the reporters, to hear. "You destroyed federal property. You caused a sinkhole. How is that safe?" Karen's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered. "Well," she said stiffly, "if Mr. Thompson had worked with us from the beginning." "Worked with you?" I cut her off. "You ignored every legal document I sent you. This isn't about safety. It's about your ego." That little exchange, it made for great TV. By that evening, clips of me calling out Karen were all over social media and local news channels. Neighbors started texting me screenshots of headlines like, "HOA President Destroys Historic Tunnel," and "Local Man Battles HOA Tyranny." Karen might have been good at intimidating people behind closed doors, but now her actions were out in the open for everyone to see, and people weren't happy about it. As much as I wanted to celebrate Karen's public humiliation, I knew this was far from over. The sinkhole wasn't just an eyesore. It was a liability, a big one, and someone was going to have to pay for it. Karen thought she could bulldoze her way through this mess, literally. But she had no idea what kind of trouble she'd unleashed by ignoring federal laws and basic common sense. And trust me, the fallout was just getting started. What do you think Karen's next move will be? Will she finally admit defeat or dig herself an even deeper hole? Let me know your thoughts below. Karen's bulldozer stunt wasn't just the beginning of her downfall. It was the spark that lit the fuse. By the time the dust had settled, both literally and figuratively, the neighborhood was buzzing with outrage. Karen had gone too far, and now her empire was crumbling from within. It started with whispers. Neighbors who had been too afraid to speak up before were suddenly finding their voices. Mike, my next-door neighbor who'd been fined $200 for his unauthorized garden gnomes, marched over to my house with a six-pack of beer and a story. "You know she tried to fine me for my Christmas lights last year, right?" he said, cracking open a can. "Said they were too bright." "Too bright," I echoed, shaking my head. "What does that even mean?" Mike shrugged. Means Karen's crazy. Turns out, Karen had been terrorizing the entire neighborhood for months. Fines for porch decorations, threats over driveway stains, even a ban on kids playing basketball in their own yards because it was too noisy. But the tunnel debacle? That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Within days of the sinkhole incident, neighbors started organizing. Someone created a Facebook group called Take Back Our HOA, where residents shared their horror stories about Karen's reign of terror. The posts ranged from infuriating to downright absurd. Karen fined me $50 because my trash can was visible from the street for 10 minutes. She banned wind chimes because they were distracting. I got a warning letter because my lawn wasn't uniform enough. And then there was me, posting pictures of the sinkhole and explaining how Karen had illegally destroyed a federally protected tunnel. My post went viral within the group, racking up hundreds of comments and likes. "She's gotta go," one neighbor wrote. "This is insane," said another. By the end of the week, someone had started a petition to remove Karen as HOA president. It gained traction fast, probably because everyone was tired of living under her iron fist. Meanwhile, Karen's problems were multiplying like rabbits. The State Historical Office launched an investigation into her actions after I filed an official complaint about the destruction of federally protected property. Turns out, tearing down a Cold War-era landmark without proper permits is kind of a big deal. The demolition crew foreman also came forward, admitting that Karen had misled him about permits and project approval. He thought he was doing routine work, not causing a sinkhole in someone's backyard. Karen's lawyer issued a statement claiming she had acted in good faith and within her authority as HOA president. But no one was buying it. Not the neighbors, not the media, and definitely not the authorities. The next HOA meeting was one for the history books. Normally, these meetings were sparsely attended. Just Karen and a handful of residents who didn't have anything better to do. But this time, the community center was packed to capacity. People were standing in doorways and spilling out into the parking lot. Karen walked in like she owned the place, wearing her signature oversized sunglasses and carrying a clipboard full of papers. She tried to start the meeting with her usual agenda: budget updates, landscaping plans, but no one cared. "We want answers," someone shouted from the back. "What gives you the right to destroy someone's property?" another yelled. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was rattled. She launched into a speech about community standards and enforcing compliance, but every word she said just made people angrier. "You caused a sinkhole," I shouted from my seat near the front. "You destroyed history, and now you're trying to act like none of this is your fault." The room erupted in applause. For once, it wasn't just me standing up to Karen. It was everyone. By the end of the meeting, it was clear Karen had lost control. Residents voted unanimously to hold an emergency election to replace her as HOA president, a vote that would take place within 2 weeks. Karen stormed out before the meeting even adjourned, muttering something about ungrateful neighbors. But her departure didn't stop people from celebrating. The Facebook group lit up with posts about how Karen's reign was finally coming to an end. "We did it! She's out! Good riddance! Let's make wind chimes legal again." As satisfying as it was to see Karen finally face consequences for her actions, I knew this fight wasn't over yet. Not for me, anyway. The sinkhole in my backyard wasn't going to magically fix itself, and someone still needed to be held accountable for destroying my grandfather's tunnel. But one thing was certain. Karen's days as HOA president were numbered, and I wasn't going to stop until she paid for what she'd done. Karen thought she could bulldoze her way through this mess, but now her empire is crumbling around her, and things are about to get even messier. Karen might have strutted out of that HOA meeting like a disgraced queen, but I wasn't about to let her off the hook. The sinkhole in my backyard wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a gaping reminder of her arrogance and recklessness. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice. And if Karen thought she could bulldoze her way through this mess without consequences, she was about to learn otherwise. The first thing I did after the meeting was hire a lawyer. A sharp, no-nonsense guy named Tom who had a reputation for taking down overreaching HOAs. When I showed him the photos of the sinkhole, the demolition crew, and Karen sipping iced tea while my driveway collapsed. His eyes lit up. "This is gold," he said, flipping through the stack of evidence I'd compiled. "She's violated federal law, state law, and probably half a dozen HOA bylaws in the process. Tom helped me file a lawsuit against Karen and the HOA for property damage, emotional distress, and violation of federal preservation laws. We also filed complaints with every agency we could think of, the State Historical Office, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, even the Army Corps of Engineers. But I didn't stop there. I wanted Karen to feel the full weight of what she'd done. So I reached out to local reporters who had covered the initial story. They were more than happy to do follow-ups, especially when I told them about the lawsuit. The media coverage was relentless. Every local news channel ran stories with headlines like, "HOA President Faces Lawsuit Over Demolition Disaster," and "Historic Tunnel Destroyed in HOA Power Play." Neighbors started sharing the articles on social media, and before long, Karen's name became synonymous with HOA horror stories. But it wasn't just her reputation that was taking a hit, her wallet was too. Turns out, Karen had authorized the demolition without proper permits or board approval, which meant she, and not the HOA, was personally liable for the damages. And let me tell you, restoring a collapsed Cold War-era tunnel isn't cheap. One of the biggest breaks in my case came when the foreman of the demolition crew decided to come clean. Apparently, Karen had told him that everything was above board, that she had all the necessary permits and approvals. But when he saw the media coverage and realized he'd been duped into destroying federal property, he wasn't too happy. The foreman gave a sworn statement admitting that Karen had misled him and his crew. He even provided emails where she downplayed the significance of the tunnel and insisted it was just an old drain pipe. That statement became a key piece of evidence in both my lawsuit and the state's investigation into Karen's actions. Meanwhile, Karen was becoming a pariah in her own neighborhood. The Facebook group, Take Back Our HOA, turned into a full-blown anti-Karen movement. People started sharing satirical memes mocking her ridiculous rules, like one showing a picture of wind chimes with the caption, "Banned for being too joyful." Someone even printed flyers with Karen's face on them that said, "Wanted for crimes against humanity and historic tunnels," and posted them around town. It was petty, sure, but also deeply satisfying. Of course, Karen wasn't going down without a fight. She hired her own lawyer, a slick guy who looked like he belonged in a daytime courtroom drama, and tried to spin herself as the victim. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign," she said during an interview with one of the local news stations. "I was simply doing my job as HOA president." But no one was buying it, not after everything that had come to light. The neighbors who once feared her were now openly laughing at her attempts to play innocent. The final nail in Karen's coffin came when the State Historical Office completed its investigation. Their report confirmed what I'd been saying all along. The tunnel was a federally protected landmark, and its destruction violated multiple preservation laws. The report also revealed that Karen had ignored multiple warnings from state officials who told her she needed proper permits before taking any action on my property. Instead of listening, she'd bulldozed ahead, literally, and now she was paying the price. By this point, it was clear that Karen's days as HOA president were numbered. The emergency election to replace her was just days away, and even her most loyal supporters were starting to distance themselves from her. But for me, this wasn't just about getting rid of Karen. It was about making sure she faced real consequences for what she'd done. And trust me, I wasn't stopping until justice was served. Karen thought she could bully me into submission, but now she's facing lawsuits, investigations, and public humiliation. And things are only going to get worse for her from here. Karen's empire was crumbling, but my backyard still looked like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. The sinkhole was a constant reminder of her reckless arrogance, and the destruction of my grandfather's tunnel felt like a personal betrayal. But as the dust settled, both figuratively and literally, I realized this wasn't just about tearing Karen down. It was about rebuilding what she had destroyed. And that's exactly what I set out to do. A few days after the State Historical Office released its damning report, I got a call from someone unexpected. A representative from the Cold War Educational Initiative. Apparently, the media coverage of the tunnel's destruction had caught their attention, and they wanted to help restore it. "We've been looking for ways to preserve Cold War history," the rep explained. "Your grandfather's tunnel could be an incredible educational resource." I almost dropped the phone. For months, I'd been fighting just to get Karen held accountable. And now I had an opportunity to turn this disaster into something meaningful. With the help of the Cold War Educational Initiative, I applied for federal grants to fund the restoration of the tunnel. It wasn't a quick process. There were forms to fill out, inspections to schedule, and endless back and forth with government agencies. But eventually, the funding came through. The restoration team arrived a few weeks later, led by contractors who specialized in historical preservation. They examined the sinkhole, assessed the damage, and assured me they could rebuild the tunnel to its original specifications. "This is going to take some time," one of them warned me, "but when we're done, it'll be better than ever." While I was busy planning the restoration, Karen was desperately trying to salvage her reputation. She showed up at the emergency HOA election wearing her usual oversized sunglasses and carrying a stack of papers she claimed would prove her innocence. "I've done nothing wrong," she declared to the crowd of neighbors gathered in the community center. "Everything I did was for the good of this neighborhood." But no one was buying it. Not anymore. The residents voted unanimously to remove her as HOA president, and Karen stormed out of the meeting before they even announced her replacement. As she walked past me on her way out, she muttered under her breath, "You'll regret this." I couldn't help but laugh. "Karen," I said calmly, "the only thing I regret is not standing up to you sooner." Over the next few months, my backyard transformed from a disaster zone into something truly remarkable. The restoration team worked tirelessly to rebuild the tunnel, carefully preserving its original design while reinforcing it with modern materials. When they finally finished, I stepped inside for the first time since Karen had destroyed it. The walls were smooth and sturdy, lined with plaques detailing its history and significance. It wasn't just a tunnel anymore. It was a monument to my grandfather's legacy. To celebrate the completion of the restoration, I hosted an open house for neighbors and local historians. People who had once been afraid to speak out against Karen now wandered through my backyard with wide eyes, marveling at what we'd accomplished. "This is incredible," Mike said as he read one of the plaques. "Your grandfather would be proud." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. For months, this fight had been about justice, but now it felt like something more. Felt like healing. As for Karen, she disappeared from public view after losing her position as HOA president. Rumor has it she moved out of town entirely, probably because she couldn't face living in a neighborhood full of people who despised her. Every now and then, someone would bring up her name during casual conversation, usually as a punchline, but for me, she was just a footnote in a much larger story. Just when I thought things were finally settling down, I got another unexpected call. This time from a national museum interested in partnering on future projects involving Cold War landmarks. They'd heard about my grandfather's tunnel and wanted to discuss ways to expand its educational reach. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but smile. Karen's actions had caused so much pain and chaos. But in an ironic twist, they'd also turned my family's history into something greater than I ever could have imagined. The tunnel is restored, Karen is gone, and my grandfather's legacy lives on. But now there's an opportunity to take things even further. If you had told me months ago that Karen's bulldozer stunt would lead to something positive, I would have laughed in your face. At the time, all I could see was the destruction. The sinkhole, the shattered legacy, the chaos she left behind. But now, standing in my backyard and looking at the restored tunnel, I realized something profound. Karen's arrogance had inadvertently set the stage for a victory far greater than I ever imagined. The emergency HOA election was a spectacle. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around Karen's wrath showed up in droves to cast their votes. It wasn't just about removing her. It was about reclaiming our neighborhood from the tyranny of her absurd rules. The results were announced within an hour. Karen was officially out, replaced by a retired school principal named Linda, a no-nonsense woman who promised to restore sanity to the HOA. Karen didn't stick around to hear the results. She stormed out of the community center before they even finished counting the votes, muttering something about ungrateful residents. As she passed me on her way to her car, She shot me a glare that could have melted steel. "Enjoy your little victory," she spat. "Oh, I will," I replied with a grin. With Karen gone and the tunnel restored, life finally started returning to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after months of chaos. My backyard no longer looked like a war zone. Instead, it had become a place of pride and purpose. The restored tunnel wasn't just a piece of history. It was a symbol of resilience. Neighbors started stopping by more often, curious about the tunnel and its story. Some even brought their kids to learn about its significance during the Cold War. It felt good to share my grandfather's legacy with others, especially knowing how close we'd come to losing it forever. Just when I thought things couldn't get any better, I got another surprise. A call from the director of a national museum specializing in Cold War history. They'd heard about the tunnel through the media coverage and wanted to partner on an educational initiative. "We think your grandfather's tunnel could be an incredible addition to our program," the director said. "Would you be interested in working with us?" I didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely," I said. Over the next few weeks, we worked out the details of the partnership. The museum provided funding for additional educational materials and even offered to host guided tours at my property. What started as a local restoration project was now becoming something much bigger, a way to preserve Cold War history for future generations. As satisfying as it was to see Karen lose her position as HOA president, her real downfall came when my lawsuit against her reached its conclusion. The court ruled in my favor, ordering Karen to pay damages for destroying federal property and causing emotional distress. She tried appealing the decision because of course she did, but it didn't get her anywhere. By the time everything was said and done, Karen owed me tens of thousands of dollars in damages. And let me tell you, cashing that check felt really good. To mark the official opening of the restored tunnel as an educational site, I hosted a community event in my backyard. Neighbors came together for food, drinks, and guided tours of the tunnel, led by historians from the museum. Mike brought his infamous garden gnomes, which were now proudly displayed without fear of fines, and Linda gave a heartfelt speech about reclaiming our neighborhood from Karen's tyranny. But for me, the highlight of the day came when my grandmother arrived. She hadn't been able to visit during all the chaos but insisted on coming for this special occasion. As she walked through the tunnel for the first time since its restoration, tears welled up in her eyes. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she said softly. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. We did it for him. As I stood in my backyard that evening, watching neighbors laugh and chat over barbecue and beer, I realized something ironic. Karen's actions had inadvertently brought us closer together as a community. Her attempt to tear down my grandfather's legacy had backfired spectacularly, and now that legacy was stronger than ever. And then came one last surprise. Another call from the museum director. They wanted to feature my grandfather's story in an upcoming exhibit on Cold War engineering innovations. It wasn't just about preserving history anymore. It was about celebrating it on a national scale. Looking back on everything that happened, the sinkhole, the lawsuits, Karen's downfall, I couldn't help but laugh at how absurd it all seemed. Who knew that fighting an HOA tyrant would lead to restoring history, strengthening community bonds, and even partnering with a national museum? Karen thought she could bully me into submission, but all she did was ignite a fire I didn't even know I had. And now my grandfather's legacy lives on, not just in my backyard but in museums and classrooms across the country. Sometimes revenge isn't just about getting even, it's about turning chaos into something meaningful. And if there's one thing I've learned from this whole ordeal, it's this: never underestimate what you can accomplish when someone tries to bulldoze your dreams, literally or figuratively. What do you think? Would you have fought back like I did? Or would you have let Karen win? Let me know your thoughts below.